So welcome everyone to this BoF here at the RDA Plenary 16 on building a fair roadmap for research software. Now there is a link to the collaborative notes that we'll be using today. Maybe if one of my co-hosts could just put that again in the chat for people as they keep coming in late so that everyone gets it. And that notes document includes a copy of these slides so that you can see all of these as we go through. My name is Michelle Barker and I'm the Director of the Research Software Alliance, and I'll be facilitating this along with some of my colleagues today to share this information with you today and engage with you all. This is the agenda, which is also in the collaborative notes if you want to refer back to it at any time. I'll start out with a bit of a conversation around what the Fair for Research Software roadmap is, and then we'll stop to enable a bit of discussion amongst the group to make sure that the concept's clear. Then we'll spend about half an hour in some breakout groups. You'll be able to choose which group you want to go to, which will be asking the question of what does each of a number of different stakeholders need from the roadmap to inform our thinking. Then we'll have the standard feedback session, and then we'll do some summation at the end on how our work is progressing and how you can continue to be involved. To start with, a little bit of Zoom etiquette that most of you are probably familiar with. If you would like to make a comment or ask a question as a participant in the participant list, you can raise your hand. You can also type into the chat. And I'll ask my co-hosts to just track if people put their hands up or put into the chat, because while I'm speaking, I'm not going to be tracking that. So that's the easiest way. Please note that we're also recording the session and will be available sometime after our session today for people to watch and continue to enjoy. The Research Software Alliance that I'm the director of is the organisation leading this work in partnership with a range of others. And we aim to ask the question of the Research Software Alliance has a mission of ensuring that research software is recognised and valued as a fundamental and vital component of research worldwide, which I'm sure is an aim or an ideal shared by many of you on this call. And the Fair for Research Software roadmap is concerned with how we can actually achieve this reality where fair research software is the research software that we're using. To start with a bit of background, what is fair? I'm going to assume that most people on this call have some familiarity with the concept that fair are research outputs that are findable, accessible, interoperable, or reusable. Since the FAIR principles were published in 2016, there's been a lot of work applying them to research data in particular, but in theory, they're meant to apply to any digital object, not only research data. So as background to this BoF, the Fair for Research Software Working Group, which is another RDA group co-convened with Force 11 and RISA, was formed to think at a community-wide level about how we apply these FAIR principles to research software. So over the last couple of years, there has been some work on thinking about how we apply elements of FAIR to research software. So the working group was brought together to try and, to try and bring together all of those different initiatives to have one community-wide international conversation about what the principles should look like when we apply FAIR to research software, and to get international agreement on some principles, and then be able to think about adoption. So the Fair for Research Software Working Group aims to deliver agreed principles by the middle of next year, some guidelines and adoption information. And if you're particularly interested in that endeavour, there's a workshop at this time tomorrow at RDA, and another workshop in a couple of weeks at the series of research software engineering events, or SOURCE. So the Fair for Research Software Working Group is focused on that particular piece. What are the principles and how do we begin to get some socialisation on them to give some advice on adoption? But then there's a large question of what happens after that. It'll be fantastic when we have agreed principles and published and available for people to keep thinking about. But if we look at the experience of FAIR data, since the publication of those principles in 2016, massive amounts of work have been done probably hundreds of different initiatives, and tens of millions of dollars have been spent. Some of them with the name of applying FAIR to different aspects of research data or different parts of FAIR. Many more concerned with that issue, but perhaps not even using the word FAIR. This is a document from 2018 done by the European Commission, which aimed to identify a whole raft of areas where fair data considerations needed some more investigation to be able to turn, at the very least, fair data into reality, but also beginning to think about other digital objects. So if we think about all these areas in which work has been done over the last few years for fair data, in which RDA has played a key role in enabling, we'd probably need to have a lot of those now occur for research software to really implement and achieve the vision of fair research software. So the roadmap was created to think about this, what next, once we have the draft principles. These are some of the many areas that will need some thinking about fair research software. What will be indicators for fair research software? What would be a maturity model look like? What would fair software certification look like? What's a fair research software curriculum or associated career profile look like? What are the interoperability frameworks and metadata that are going to need to come into existence? And some of the sub-questions that fall out of this, what's needed by who, which stakeholders need which of these, and when do they need them? After we have the principles middle of next year, which of these needs to come next? What are the building blocks that enable other pieces to then come over the years? So for example, we probably need indicators before we can get to metrics and before we can get to a maturity model. Then the questions are, who's already working on some of this, given that there are organizations working on aspects of FAIR for research software, and how could we bring them together to have a coordinated effort? What resourcing do they need to achieve that? And very critically for this audience, what can we learn from the FAIR data equivalents? So FAIR research data, there's been lots of work, particularly by RDA and others, identifying what fair data looks like in all of these areas. So as we think about the same questions for fair research software, how can we learn from that experience and not reinvent the wheel to some degree? So the FAIR for Research software roadmap aims to map both existing projects or people who are interested in being part of different projects on areas like metrics or career profiles or interoperability into a longer term framework over 2 to 3 years and to use that to guide further investment. Identify who's already working on it or who might like to be working on it. And that includes organisations that have done so for fair data and would be willing to share their expertise. And also to identify roadmap elements that are specific to research software. So as we apply the FAIR principles to a range of digital objects, they are meant in theory to be applicable equally to any digital object. But as we apply them to research software, it's becoming increasingly clear, and this is the work of the FAIR for Research Software Working Group, that some of the FAIR principles apply nicely to software. There's a lot of similarities and there's a lot of alignment there. But software also has some properties that makes it quite different to data. It has versioning and executability issues which don't come up for data. So some of the FAIR principles don't apply perfectly to software, and there may be things that are needed to make software fair that don't exist within the existing FAIR principles. So the FAIR for Research Software Working Group will unpack all of that, but as we go forward in the roadmap, we need to be aware that there may be those elements that are quite new when we're talking about the FAIR principles when we apply them to software. There's a link in the notes that you can look at where we've tried to do a very, very early draft of what the roadmap might look like that shows the number of the areas that I've mentioned before, indicators, maturity models, interoperability, fair software repositories, etc. And has started to list who are some of the organisations working in that area, what might be an equivalent fair data initiative. So this is one of the lines from that to give you an idea. And our hope is that over the next few months, we'll continue to unpack who's already doing different things in different areas and what are all the different areas that we may need to look at, and therefore fill out that form, that table in much more detail, with the aim then of bringing together the relevant organisations for each row to have a conversation about, when the principles come out middle of next year, what could we do now to be prepared for that? How might each of us contribute to a group effort to then build upon those principles, to think about how to enable metrics or repository certification or curriculums based on them. So that is the vision of the FAIR for Research Software roadmap. And I'm going to stop at this point before we go into the breakouts and invite questions to understand how well we've been able to share that concept, and to learn from all of you if there's other things that we need to be considering, and to ask for your feedback. So let me stop my screen share for a moment so that I can see the chat. So as I said before, you can put your hand up if you would like to ask a question or give any input. That would be fantastic. Or you can also write things into the chat. We'd particularly be interested to hear from people who have had some of the experience of doing this in the data community, of applying the FAIR principles. And we started this initiative because we thought, in 2020, we're now at the stage where we're having FAIR convergence events to try and bring together all the many different strands applying the FAIR principles to data. So if we wanted to learn one thing from the FAIR data experience, it would be that some forward thinking about how to coordinate this concept might assist to remove duplication and avoid gaps coming up. So we decided to learn from that experience and try and do this road mapping exercise in advance. Any questions or comments? If not, we can go on to the breakout.
I'll just general comment, Michelle. Can you hear me okay, Michelle?
Yes, Mark.
Hello?
I can hear someone, but I'm not sure who it is.
They can hear me okay. Just a, yeah, it's Mark Leggett. Just a general comment. I know the organization that I work for, Canary, development of research software focused on the research data management piece, and our earlier calls required submitters to articulate intersections with the FAIR principles in the context of their software development effort. So it was an interesting process to see, in some cases, a very kind of articulate and mature reflection of how the software components in a platform could support the FAIR principles. And then in others where the submitters essentially said, yes, we do FAIR. So there's a comment to note that there's a huge variation, especially in the community of researchers and PIs that typically build software frameworks in the research context, about what FAIR means. So that was, it was a bit of an uphill battle, but then more recently I reviewed some submissions for a funding program in the US from the Department of Energy. And while it was a similar kind of profile from little understanding of FAIR to substantial, it was nice to see that more and more funders are requiring an articulation of the FAIR principles in the context of software development. So that's maybe just an observation or comment.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And we certainly are in a good position in that there's already been enough socialization of FAIR data, or some significant socialization. So as you say, some of the key stakeholders are already cognizant and doing efforts to implement FAIR. So it's a great starting point. Any other comments or questions? Maggie, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, hello everybody. I work with a research infrastructure in Europe, which is operating its own data repository. And we are also now starting to think of how do we deal with the software, especially scripts and say Jupyter notebooks and things like that, so that we can connect what our end users are doing and also part of what we are doing ourselves in terms of processing data, so that we can make also the software fair and make it available via our repository, etc. So I do have some, I hope I can bring some of our experiences into the breakouts. But I also wanted to say that I also teach research data management in general to graduate students at that level. And I found that they have, in Sweden where I work, and I found that they have, and also their supervisors have extremely low levels of knowledge and understanding about sharing anything, be it data, software, or other components of the research data life cycle, so to speak. So I think that's where there's going to be an enormous uphill battle to fight, is to really have this information trickle down, that it's okay to share what they feel is their intellectual property with others in a controlled manner. So I'm really looking forward to what can come out in the coming year now or years on how we can also address software and not just data or metadata.
Yes, I think that's very true. And I was talking to the conveners of the Fair Data Maturity Model Working Group recently, and they very strongly emphasized just how much socialization of the concept is needed. So it's great when we get to the stage of having the FAIR principles applied to research software in an internationally community agreed way. It'll be great as we define other tools such as metrics or FAIR software curriculums or FAIR software repository certification, whatever else comes next. But as you say, the socialization to get the cultural change is a massive part of that. And I guess it'll be interesting to see how much each of those initiatives does their own socializations versus some kind of international effort.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that one aspect that we should not forget, and I'm not quite sure how to fit that into the FAIR principles as such, but that is quality of the software or whatever digital object actually that you're trying to make fair. That we spend some time on thinking of how do we capture that correctly in the metadata, so that people really can understand the level of development, so to speak, and how much effort has gone into an item of software to be used in research.
Would any of my co-hosts like to speak to the issue of quality of software and some of the efforts around, for example, on code checking?
Maybe perhaps Neil would want to as well, who's not a co-host, but has done quite a bit here.
Hi there. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. What software quality means, I think, differs from community to community, and I think it's about understanding what the aim of doing this is. Is it around assurance? Is it around reproducibility? Is it around some of the other reasons why you're wanting to do this? And there are some good initiatives that have come up in the last few years that address some of these. Michelle mentioned CodeCheck, which is looking more at software quality for reproducibility. And I've been seeing a lot more different types of guidelines for how to check software quality, particularly as a result of the COVID-19 modeling codes, and wanting to ensure that the results that are coming out of that are reliable. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but it's certainly an area where a lot of progress is being made.
That sounds very positive. Thank you.
I should maybe add one other note, that there is a working group that's starting up that's being facilitated by F1000 on code review, and that's looking primarily at I think it's three different streams. One which is looking at code review for developers whilst the software is being developed. One is looking at code review at the time of publication and presumably deposit as well. And also what advice and guidance should be given to funders and policymakers with regards to code review. So I think that's going to provide some interesting impetus for this work.
I just wanted to add a comment about software quality, which I personally don't regard as part of FAIR principles for research software, but there's a discussion around that because we might ask ourselves how FAIR principles can benefit software and if it should include something about checking quality, the software quality. But really, that's in my opinion a very high level question to put on the FAIR principles. And if we are here discussing the FAIR roadmap, I don't think that quality is something that should be included in the FAIR principles.
I think that you need the metadata model that is adequate. It really goes into both interoperability and reuse aspects here. I'm not talking about that the actual checking of the quality or fitness for use of a piece of software, that belongs into FAIR as such, but really looking at how can we clearly indicate these things, tie it into, say, badging systems or whatever. And I think that's going to be a really essential piece of the trust aspect, as was mentioned by Neil here. So just to keep it in mind.
Yeah, yes, I completely agree with your comment now about the curation quality, as I call it, but not the software quality itself on doing good software or correct software.
And I note there's a comment from Josh in the chat. And Josh, if you want to speak to this further, that there's a need to reconcile FAIR with other more common frames, open source, sustainable, maintained, etc. Certainly all these words have similar but not identical meanings, that there's some overlapping aims between all of those and between open sources particularly, that causes some challenges. So FAIR is of course a term that has been widely used in the research data community, particularly in Europe. It's become central to the European Open Science Cloud effort. But as we often talk about, FAIR may not be enough for software, that there are other aspects of software that mean that there may be other things that we need to emphasize as well. Josh, did you want to speak further to that?
I didn't have a ton more to say at the moment. I think it's a level of discussion that I'm finding myself eager to have. I would just push even a little further beyond what you said, not just that there are other ways of talking, but those other ways of talking do real work for different communities. And I think figuring out what FAIR brings and how to, like, I find I want the crosswalk between these different ways of thinking in the context of research software.
Did anybody else want to respond on those issues?
Can I have a crack at that?
Yeah, go Tom.
We've definitely had discussion in the subgroups along those lines. In fact, I think there was a norming phase where we had to agree that what we were talking about was the same thing. And it's a notable thing that with the FAIR data principles, it was a bringing together of different perspectives, a bridging of repository-minded folk or archive science practices with researcher practices and forming that bridge. And I think we've got a three-way bridge that we have to tackle in this bit of work between those same two perspectives and also the software engineering perspective. And it's very, very notable that words like repository or version or all of these things, they have very specific, and I totally agree, very specific and meaningful meanings that we have to be aware of as we define the principles themselves.
Thanks, Tom. And I see Dan's added to the chat that citable certainly may be an attribute that we need to add to FAIR, that FAIR is not necessarily enough for software.
Hey,
We might now...
Sorry, Michelle, I just wanted to say one other thing, which is that I think it's unfortunate we had these two sessions in the order they are, because at this time tomorrow, we're going to have the session where we talk about what is FAIR for research software. And so I guess I was just going to say that we don't, in some ways for this discussion, we don't need to talk about that too much. We just have to assume that we're going to figure it out. And the question here really is once we figured it out, how do we actually get it to be implemented?
Thanks, Dan. To go back to our main agenda, we're now going to go to 3 different breakout sessions. You can have a choice which breakout you wish to go to. So we're asking you to place yourself in the shoes of a stakeholder group. It doesn't have to be the stakeholder group that you are actually a part of. You can choose to think about another. And to choose to be one of these stakeholders, a researcher, a research software engineer, or a catch-all group of funder, policymaker, or publisher. In that group, you'll spend 30 minutes of facilitated discussion answering these 2 questions. And please use the links in the collaborative notes to find your own Google Doc where you can answer these questions. What will your stakeholder group need to implement FAIR for research software? If we go back to this vision of the roadmap enabling FAIR research software to be a reality, what does your stakeholder group particularly need to achieve that? And then to think about which of those things you might need first to help us think about some of the prioritization. So I will now set up the breakout groups. So I'd like to enable this, I need you all to think about which group you want to be in and change the name that you have on your Zoom to reflect that. So if you'd like to be in the researcher group, change your name to one researcher, or one leave your own name there, probably makes more sense actually, or 2 then your own name, so that I can assign people. If you end up in the wrong group, you should just be able to exit and come back to this main session where I can reassign you, or if you simply want to shift groups for any reason, you can do so. So let me just stop screen sharing so that I can do the breakout rooms. So I see some of you have been able to rename. If you're not sure how to rename on your menu bar, where you should have things like participants, chat, mute, stop video, if you click on participants, there should be a whole list of names, of which yours is at the top, and you should be able to highlight yourself and then get a button that says more, at least on mine, the Mac system, and enables you to rename. If not, you can put into the chat. I'll try and be very clever and watch that as well, to specify in the chat which group you'd like to be in. All right, so just bear with me for a couple of minutes while I go through and assign everyone, and then you'll be put in the group. Hi, let me just figure out how to still add you. One moment, please. Hi, are you having a problem joining it?
Sorry, sorry, Michelle. I have joined the group, but then I walked out.
Sure. Which one did you want to be in?
Is the research software engineer.
Okay, I'll move you now.
Thank you. Sorry for that. I was already there, but then I closed Zoom. Thank you.
All right, it looks like we have all 3 groups returned. We've at least got their facilitators. We'll just go through in order. So starting with group 1 from Tom's group, then Dan's, then Neil's. If someone would like to do a report back, you can share your screen if you wish, or I can share the document you've been writing into if you prefer. So Tom's group, would someone like to kick us off with a summary of what engaging conversation you had? Oh, I'm over enthusiastic. We haven't got Tom's group back.
Yeah, I was thinking we lost a number of people, but okay.
So was I, but I was trying not to voice that concern.
And strangely, they all start with a 1.
All right, I've closed their room, so they've got 60 seconds before they will be removed. Well, it certainly looked like from my drop-in on the various groups that there were some very useful conversations happening. I look forward to reading all the notes in detail. Dan?
No, I was just going to comment. I wasn't sure how Neil's group did, but I think in our group, we kind of decided that there wasn't really very much that we were going to be able to do in the last minute, so we just gave up.
All right, they'll be kicked out in a few seconds and back with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the main group. We now have 15 minutes for report back, so up to 5 minutes from each group. We'll go through in order, starting with group 1, Tom's group, then Dan's, then Neil's. So if a speaker from that group would like to give us a summary, you can share your screen if you wish, or I can share my screen with your notes if you prefer. So over to Tom's group.
I had to admit I was assuming I was doing the report back, but Moran, I'm willing to cede, seeing as you were the primary note taker, if you like, but otherwise I'll go for it.
Go for it, Tom. I'm not prepared for that.
So I think we, let's have a look. I think, well, if I could begin with the end, I think that what we centered on when we were truly trying to inhabit that perspective of a researcher is that the credit settings or the incentive settings needed to be just so to get most people over the line in implementing or adopting a set of fair principles for research software. And so that essentially flowed on to the key stakeholders like policymakers, funders, and publishers, recognizing the value of a set of fair principles for research software, and making some change there as well. But so then having begun at the end, I'll go back to the beginning, and the flow of the conversation was actually more along the lines of that the policy settings were important in the first case, and then the infrastructure that was available that actually made it possible to do this in the first place was also very much important. And without those things in place, nothing was particularly going to change. So I think that's, and then, yeah, so we talked about the Center for Open Sciences pyramid, the model for or strategy for culture change. And I think everybody in the room liked it as a guiding principle to talk about a set of priorities. And so reading that from bottom to top, you tackle the necessary infrastructure, the ease of use, the communities, or making it normative in the community, and then having incentives and policy roughly in that order, or exactly in that order, as being things that needed to be addressed. Yet the image is also in the notes for the breakout as well. I think there was also a strong discussion around a culture of citation and what that would mean for researchers. And I think we acknowledged that that would be very diverse and would vary from domain to domain. But creating the setting for that culture of citation to emerge was a really key factor. But yeah, we landed on credit as the or activities that support the credit as being one of the early things that needed to be addressed from a researcher perspective. Okay.
Thanks, Tom. Dan's group?
Yeah, so I guess I'll do this unless somebody else wants to. Okay. So I feel like we struggled a little bit for a variety of reasons, mostly because this is a really hard problem, and also because some of the things that we talked about, I think, were more in terms of like defining what FAIR is rather than how we implement it. But nonetheless, I think what I guess I would try to summarize a little bit. Oh, sorry. The other challenge is that in the role of RSEs, we are kind of doing multiple things. So we're developing software, but we're also using other people's software, and so we kind of get stuck in having to do everything in some ways. So I think we overall tried to. We kind of tried to do a few different things at different times. So one thing was we were trying to cast a little bit in terms of reproducibility, and thinking about if reproducibility was a goal and was part of the reason for FAIR, what we would actually need to get there. And then we were thinking about things like description of the software, an easy to use tool or system that helps me track what I've used, like some kind of provenance that would be able to be used also then for credit, so that I could credit other people whose things I've used. Some kind of potentially virtual environment technology that lets us take software that we've written or that somebody else has written and lets us use it again in the future. And then we kind of, I guess, went more into thinking about the individual letters of FAIR. And we're thinking that for something to be findable, we need maybe citations or identifiers or metadata. And there's some role of repositories, but then there's multiple kinds of repositories of software development repositories like GitHub, and then more archival preservation repositories. There's a need to actually store the metadata somewhere, and is that in the repository or is that somewhere else? There's, I think, a lot of questions that we had about commercial software and how that fits in, because it's hard to figure out how we would make commercial software findable, or how we would make it accessible, or how we would make it interoperable, or how we would make it reusable, actually. So all of it was pretty hard for that. Whereas open source was quite a bit easier in some ways because we have more control and there's more things we could do. So I think maybe the last thing that I could say here is that one of the things that we're thinking about that would be really good and maybe would be something that we could do more quickly would be to have some kind of a best practices guide that talks about for software developers about how they should make their software fair. And that then potentially could point to specific systems, or it could kind of point to a variety of systems, but it would also then let us know where there were kind of systems that were needed. So I think the challenge in some ways is that we're trying to do like too many different things at once. Define FAIR, define what the system is for FAIR, define what the policies are. and maybe starting with one thing like a guide and trying just to work through the guide and figure out if that helps us then kind of figure out some of the other pieces along the way would be maybe a first step.
Thanks, Dan. Neil?
Okay. We had a really interesting discussion in our group, which was looking at funders, policymakers, and publishers, but actually all of the challenges and enablers that we discussed were around funding and publishing. So I've not got much to say about policymakers apart from the fact that some of the stuff we discussed probably applies to them as well. It's interesting. The conclusion I'll get to probably chimes very closely with the breakout group 1. But in terms of the things that we discussed around what would help funders implement FAIR for research software, I think that came down to a few different things. The first was helping understand how we could create tooling that works in place so that there's not people who are applying for funding don't have to jump through hoops, and funders don't have to do particularly much to get things working, and with low friction that can measure the fairness of a project as it continues. So this is probably very similar to the intent of a data management plan, which is created before a project proposal goes in and is measured as the project continues. Another thing that we felt we needed was to provide guidance for reviewers, and this is both for funding proposals and for publishers of deposits of software with publishers, to understand how to map fairness of software to other aspects. And I think this is something that other groups have mentioned and is a really tricky thing. It's something that I don't think we necessarily know how to do yet, and it's tied intrinsically to an understanding of how the FAIR guidelines for software will turn out. But then we went on to discuss some other things, which included understanding whether we could help create fairness through the use of technology. So some publishers have been looking at the way that platforms can be used, things like CodeOcean, to improve the effort required for doing reviewing. And that led into a discussion around, firstly, ensuring sustainability of these platforms and not getting locked in, but also around what role these different infrastructures played in making things fair. And one possibility is, much as we've seen with some of the certification of data repositories, it could be that simply using a particular platform that has been certified automatically gets you up to the minimum requirements for one of the categories of FAIR, and using multiple platforms that are recommended by, say, a funder or a publisher means that in that instant you hit your fairness criteria, and what we're trying to kind of measure is the fairness of the infrastructure in making software fair than individual pieces of software. And that just helps in terms of the effort required. But ultimately, when we were discussing what's required first to allow all of these different things to become enablers, we're back at the same thing that was coming out of the discussion in group 1. It's about defining how people get credit for fairness of their software, or indeed how fairness increases the credit that you should accrue for your software. And until we understand how we do this, a lot of the other things are going to be difficult to implement because we can't give incentives, we can't give rewards, and we can't really interact with all of the different actors in the ecosystem to ensure that everyone has an incentive to make software fair. So yeah, it sounds like we're in agreement with a lot of the other groups coming at it from the funder and publisher perspective as well.
Thanks, Neil. Before I just do a bit of a wrap up, did anyone want to make any comments or ask any questions about any of those summaries?
Just the thought that popped into my head then is that this seems pretty normal if our headline aim is to bring research software into the scholarly ecosystem, then its position in the ecosystem is the first, you know, that credit is intimately tied with that that straightforward, well, not straightforward, but, you know, big agenda.
So just one final comment from me. I think all of this that has come up and surfaced during our discussion today, it also ties back to the need for perhaps yet another paradigm shift and now from the point of view of researchers, is that I feel that researchers today, even though they do have already all these gazillions of tools to their disposal, they are still in some way doing research in a way that is reflecting the standards from 10 or maybe even 15, 20 years ago, in that they are not fully exploiting all the things that are at their disposal in order to document in great enough detail their process and also, as someone was saying, provenance of all the products that are coming out of their activity. So I think that this, if we can get researchers to become more involved in that and more active in documenting what they are doing along the lines or along their whole work, then many of these things like citation, giving credit where credit is due, etc., will just materialize. But we are far from that, I'm afraid, especially in some disciplines where people tend to still work in smaller groups or maybe even still almost at an individual basis.
Thanks, Maggie. Dan?
Yeah, I guess I don't know, maybe I was thinking something kind of similar to Maggie, but I was, I guess, thinking that when the FAIR data work started, that originally there were a lot of, I would say, very strong, very systematic goals and changes that were desired in terms of like changing how research is done and how products are used. But then in some ways, FAIR ended up actually being, FAIR for data ends up actually being a little bit smaller than that. That it somehow, I think, managed to divide off a section of the research work in a way that it could be scoped and that there could be some fairly practical pieces put around it, fairly practical principles and guidelines and policies. And at this point, when I think about software, I don't know how we do the equivalent. I feel like when we try to address software, we get stuck in trying to address all of the problems with research. And so I guess I'm wondering if there's some way of doing something kind of like I think what happened with FAIR and trying to say we're not trying to solve everything for research, we're just trying to solve some things around software. And right now I don't actually know how to do that, but that's just what I'm kind of thinking is there a way of making the challenge that we have more tractable?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting comment because when there was discussion earlier on the need for credit, I was thinking we haven't really solved that for data either. At the moment, people don't necessarily get recognized for sharing their data. Maybe we're a little bit further along, but I don't think we're there on that aspect either.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to respond to that really quickly, I feel like the data, in a lot of ways, what happened with data, sorry, and I feel like I've said this before, so sorry if you've heard this before, but I feel like what happened with data basically is that there was a group of people that figured out that we can kind of treat data like papers, but we can do it a little bit better than papers. Right? We can kind of do it like more ideal papers in some sense. We make people deposit the data. We make sure that there's metadata that's provided by the repositories that ensures findability and accessibility and interoperability and reusability. We just say are community problems, and it's hard to do kind of in a large sense. And so, I don't know. I guess I'm a little bit wondering if we could do something like that with software as well. Can we? Is there something that works kind of okay now that we could kind of force software to fit into? I feel like we kind of tried to do that with citation, for software by making software like papers, and I'm a little bit feeling like that's not working so well in general. But I don't know. I guess I'm again just trying to think about how we can kind of scope the problem we're trying to address.
Okay, we might go back just to a few concluding comments so that you can all get to the next event in 8 minutes. I think there's a networking event on the RDA agenda that people can get involved with. To sum up some of what we've been talking about today, in terms of next steps, we're doing a workshop similar to this one at the International Fair Convergence Symposium on 1st of December, which is free to register. What we'll be doing with the information that we get from today and that session and continuing conversations with organisations is to try and understand where are the areas we should concentrate some efforts early on. So for example, the Fairs Fair report that came out a couple of months ago that Moraine Gruenpeters are involved in, who's on this call, makes lots of recommendations around how we should develop FAIR principles for research software. And one of the recommendations is that each principle should also have a metric. So perhaps that's a priority area, and we certainly have identified a few different groups already working in that who might be interested to come together early next year and begin that conversation. But what are the other priority areas? And that's why we asked you to think about the building blocks in each of your breakout groups. Credit is particularly emerging strongly. One of the groups was also talking about the need to work from a use case basis. Perhaps we should focus around a discipline like life sciences. Groups like Elixir have done a lot of looking at some of the FAIR aspects of research software. Maybe that's another way to tackle it, to make sure that we're grounded in specific questions that stakeholders need answered, rather than only creating principles that don't merge with those problems. So as we do those, we'd then like to convene our first meetings early next year and get those groups thinking about how they could move their particular aspect forward. So we're very keen to hear about other initiatives that are relevant to our thinking. The roadmap URL there is there again. You can edit that, comment on it. Please let us know if there's other groups or programs or individuals working in any of those areas who we should be talking to. And we've also set up a roadmap email list so that people can subscribe to updates on our work. I'd like to thank the Research Steering Committee and the FAIR for Research Software Working Group Steering Committee for having led a lot of the thinking on this area. But really our work stands on the shoulders of giants in that we're able to build on the work that so much of our community and the FAIR community in general has done in thinking about how to apply this in other areas. There's so much we can learn from. So thank you to everyone and to all of you here today. It's been fantastic to have this conversation and get some inputs into how we can refine our thinking and continue to work more broadly with the community. And I would just re-emphasize that the FAIR for Research Software Working Group meeting is on this time tomorrow, or at the start of this session time, if you'd like to have some updates on the more detailed work that's been happening there. So thank you everyone for your time and look forward to seeing you in another RDA session soon. Thank you.